In the name of God the Gracious, the Merciful, all praise is to God, and peace be upon His servants whom He chose. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. According to common Muslim interpretation of Surah 3, verse 7, it is said that God talks about two different types of verses. The first type being called al-muhkamat, or commonly translated as clear or straightforward, whereas the second type is called mutashabihat, commonly translated as allegorical. So according to this understanding, the Quran, each verse in the Quran is either going to be clear or it is going to be allegorical. But there are a couple of problems with this idea. The first problem is that there is no real Quranic guideline that tells us what type of verse is each verse in the Quran. I could open the Quran and read a verse, but I won't know for sure what type of verse is this verse. The second problem is that there's no real agreement amongst the Muslims as to what type of verse is each verse. I could be reading a verse and say, well, this verse is clear, whereas someone else might disagree and say this verse is an allegorical verse. So there are a couple of problems with this idea. Instead, let me give you my understanding of Surah 3, verse 7. The first part of the verse says, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. He is the one who sent down onto you the book. From it are verses which are muhkamat, they are the source of the book, and others mutashabihat. The first key word is muhkamat, and it comes from the root word hakama, and hakama means restriction. This is why, for example, the word judge in Arabic comes from this root word, because the judge places restrictions or rules. So I would render muhkamat as law-giving. And the second key word is mutashabihat, and it comes from the root word shabaha. And shabaha means to be similar or to look like something else. So according to this verse, God is saying that He is the one who sent down onto you the book. From it are verses which are clear, are law-giving. They are the source of the book, and others that are similar or similitude. So at first glance, we may be thinking that God is talking about two different types of verses, but in reality He is not. God is saying that each and every verse in the Quran contains both qualities. Each verse will have a law-giving quality and it will have a similitude quality. To clarify, look at Surah 11 verse 1. God says, كِتَابٌ أُحْكِمَتْ آيَاتُهُ ثُمَّ فُصِّلَتْ. A book in which its verses have been law-giving, أُحْكِمَتْ. That means the entire Quran, the entire verses in the Quran, all the verses in the Quran are law-giving. God also says in Surah 39 verse 24 that the entire Quran is mutashabih. God says, Allahu nazala ahsan al-hadith kitaban mutashabihan. A book that is mutashabihan, that is of similitude. So the entire Quran is also mutashabih. So according to the Quran, according to 3:7, we see that each and every verse in the Quran is going to be law-giving and it is going to be of similitude. But what does that really mean? If you have read the Quran from cover to cover, you would have noticed that there are certain rules, laws, stories that have been often repeated throughout the Quran. And this is exactly what Surah 3 verse 7 is talking about. I'll give you an example. Look at Surah 5 verse 6. God talks about the ablution, the washing that we need to do before observing or attending the Salah sessions. And this washing is also nullified by certain ways. This verse in of itself, 5:6, is a law-giving verse, but it is also similar to Surah 4 verse 43, where God talks about also what nullifies the ablution. 4:43 in of itself is a law-giving verse, and it is also a similar verse to 5:6. So 5:6 and 4:43 correlate together. They are both law-giving verses and they are similar to each other. And this is why God says, وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ, and others that are similar. Another example is the prohibition of certain foods. Like in Surah 2 verse 137, God talks about the certain types of foods that are prohibited. And similarly, you can see the same thing, but in more or specific detail in Surah 5, verse 3. And it goes on. The stories of Moses, of Adam, and so on and so forth, these stories have law-giving qualities and they are similar to each other. They are often repeated. So basically, Surah 3, verse 7 talks about how the Quran explains itself. It is a fully detailed scripture, and therefore it is explaining itself. Now the second part of the verse says, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. As for those who have diseases in their hearts, they will pursue what is of similar to it, مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ, similar to it, in pursuit of discord and trying to reach an interpretation, into ultimate interpretation. Now, God says here, those who have diseases in their hearts will pursue what is similar to it. مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ. The it here in Arabic, minhu, is masculine. It is not feminine. It's masculine, meaning that God is talking about the book. If God was talking about the verses in the Quran, ayat, is feminine. But God here is saying minhu. Minhu, God is talking about the book. So God is talking about the Quran. As for those who have diseases in their hearts, they will pursue what is similar to the Quran, to it being the Quran. And this is amazing, because if you look at the context of the passage, the verses preceding, God is talking about the other or the previous scriptures. So God is saying that those who have diseases in their hearts, they will pursue the other scriptures in pursuit of trying to interpret the Quran. So God is saying that there is, basically, He's saying that there is no other source besides the Quran that will explain the Quran. It is only the Quran that would explain itself. And amazingly, we can apply this to today, where the hadith books and the sunnah are being used to try to interpret the Quran, to try to reach a solid conclusion about the Quran. Whereas God is telling us in 3:7 that the Quran explains itself and it's sufficient. This is the way I understand Surah 3, verse 7. Assalamu alaikum, and inshallah see you in the next video.